the curse of a kingless throne. Long ago, before the gods had withdrawn from the affairs of men, there stood the great city of Athens, noble, proud, and radiant beneath the gaze of Olympus. Yet for all its splendor, the city bore a silent curse, one etched not in stone, but in fate itself. It was a kingdom without a future, a throne without an heir, and a king whose name was whispered with reverence and sorrow. Aegeus. King Aegeus, ruler of Athens, was a man of might and intellect, respected by allies and feared by foes. But behind the veil of dignity and the crown of laurels lay a heart weighed with grief. For despite the riches of his realm and the triumphs of his reign, Aegeus bore no son to inherit his legacy. The people whispered, the nobles conspired, and the gods, it seemed, remained silent. It was not for lack of trying. The king had taken wives, offered sacrifices, and pleaded with priests. Each year, as the festivals of Demeter and Dionysus came and went, so too did Aegeus's hopes wither like summer flowers in autumn wind. As his hair silvered and his eyes lost their fire, desperation overtook him, a fear more haunting than death, the end of his bloodline. One fateful night, as the stars trembled over the Acropolis and the olive trees groaned in the wind, Aegeus sought counsel from the Pythia, the oracle of Delphi, the mouthpiece of Apollo himself. His chariot raced over dusted roads, driven not by horses, but by the storm in his soul. The sanctuary of Delphi loomed like a sacred wound in the mountain's side, where the past and future coiled like twin serpents. Clothed in gold and shadow, the priestess sat upon her tripod, wreathed in laurel, her eyes distant with divinity. Smoke curled from burning laurel leaves, filling the air with whispers that were not of this world. Kneeling, Aegeus asked his question with trembling voice. "Will the gods grant me a son to carry forth the name of Athens?" The oracle's voice came not as an answer, but as a riddle that chilled the very blood in his veins. "Do not loosen the bulging mouth of the wineskin until you have reached the highest point of Athens. Nothing more." The riddle plagued Aegeus like a dream that would not wake. What wineskin? What mouth? What did it mean to loosen it? And why must he wait until reaching the highest point of Athens? Confused and burdened with uncertainty, Aegeus made his journey back. But fate, as the gods know, does not wander blindly, it strikes precisely. And so along the way, Aegeus came upon the court of Pythius, the wise king of Troezen. Pythius, known for his mastery of riddles and divine wisdom, welcomed Aegeus with feasts and firelight. That night, over goblets of spiced wine, Aegeus confided in the old king, revealing the words of the oracle. Pythius listened, and as the flames from the hearth danced in his ancient eyes, something stirred within him. Aegeus did not see the subtle the twitch of purpose hidden behind his beard. For Pythius had a daughter, Aethra, beautiful as a springtime wise, beyond her years. And so it came to pass that under the influence of wine prophecy and Pythius's subtle plotting, Aegeus lay with Aethra. The sky above Troezen turned from silver to crimson, and a new thread was spun upon the great loom of destiny. But the gods, ever watchful, added their own design. That same night, as Aethra slept upon the shores of the sea, the goddess Athena appeared in her dreams. "Rise, daughter of Troezen," she whispered. "Cross the waters to the sacred island of Sphyria, and there fulfill what the fates have written." Aethra obeyed. Guided by a dream more vivid than life, she walked into the waves and crossed to the island under the cloak of night. There, upon sacred ground, Poseidon, god of the sea, claimed her. Thus the child she carried would bear two fathers, one mortal, one divine. When Aegeus awoke, the weight of the oracle's words returned to him. He realized that it was not yet time to speak of sons or fate. Before he departed, he took Aethra to a grove where the roots of an ancient tree curled around a boulder, heavy and unyielding. There, beneath the whispering leaves, he buried his sword and his sandals. He turned to Aethra with solemn eyes. "If the child born of this night is a son," he said, "and he proves himself strong and worthy, tell him of me. Tell him to lift this stone when he is of age. If he can retrieve what lies beneath, let him come to Athens, and I will know him as my own." And with that, Aegeus departed, leaving behind a woman with child, a riddle in the earth, and a story that would outlive even the gods. Years passed like leaves in the wind. In Troezen the child was born and named Theseus. He grew not as ordinary boys do, but with the fire of kings and the pulse of oceans. He was brave, fierce and thoughtful, a boy touched by fate. But that is a tale for another night. As for Aegeus, he returned to Athens older, wearier, and cloaked in silence. The burden of prophecy weighed heavily upon him. Though he took no further wife, he ruled his people with justice and strength. Yet within the walls of his palace he walked alone, his footsteps echoing like unanswered prayers. He often stood upon the cliffs of Sounio, where the wind screamed and the waves crashed like ancient drums. There, he watched the sea, as if it might speak to him, as if the gods might answer his quiet ache. The people called him a wise and just king, but in truth he was a man waiting for a sign, a whisper in the wind, a glint of a sword, or a pair of sandals returned by a stranger. Unbeknownst to him, destiny had already begun to stir, for deep in Troezen, a boy was coming of age. A boulder slept atop secrets, and in the eyes of the gods, a plan was unfolding. The future of Athens would soon arrive, not with horns or thunder, but with the silent shifting of fate's great wheel. And the sea, oh the sea, it listened, it waited, it remembered. For one day it would bear the name of a king whose heart had drowned in love, grief, and prophecy, a secret union, and a hidden sword. The wind in Troezen always carried with it the scent of salt and prophecy, brushing across fields of thyme and olive trees, as if whispering secrets only the gods could hear. And under such a sky, beneath the eyes of immortals, was born a child unlike any other. Aethra named him Theseus. From the very moment he first cried, the birds paused mid-flight, and even the breeze seemed to halt, sensing that something eternal had stepped into time. Theseus, son of Aethra, grandson of King Pittheus, was not raised with the indulgence of kings or the shelter of luxury. He was taught discipline, the weight of silence, and the meaning of strength, not merely of the body, but of the spirit. Though the people of Troezen thought him merely the son of their wise king's daughter, Aethra kept in her heart the fire of truth, that her child bore the blood of Aegeus and the breath of Poseidon. And so she watched over him not only with a mother's tenderness, but with the awe of someone who knew that destiny slept within her child's chest like a lion curled in the dark. As he grew, it became clear that Theseus was no ordinary boy. He was quick to listen, slow to anger, and yet when anger stirred in him, it surged like the tide pulled by a hidden moon. He could run faster than the deer in the forests of Troezen, and could lift stones that left grown men breathless. But it was not his strength alone that marked him. It was his eyes. There was a searching in them, a storm held at bay. Even as a child, he asked questions of the stars. He would sit by the shoreline, gazing out at the waves, as though trying to hear a voice that called from across the sea. Aethra knew it would not be long. One day when Theseus had entered the fullness of youth, his body lean and hard from training his face, shadowed with the early signs of manhood. Aethra brought him to a quiet grove, where wild flowers danced beneath twisted trees and moss cloaked the earth like forgotten memory. There at the edge of the grove stood the stone. It was not an ordinary stone, but a slab of mountain itself, half buried and cracked with age. Even the roots of the nearby trees had curved around it, as though afraid to disturb what lay beneath. Aethra's voice, though calm, carried a weight her son had never heard before. "My son," she said, "your strength has grown, and your heart has shown its truth. You must know now what has waited for you in silence." She walked toward the stone and placed her hand upon its rough surface. "Many years ago, before you were born, your father came to Troezen seeking answers. He was not of this land. He was King Aegeus of Athens, and he came to my father Theseus with a question meant for the gods." Theseus stood frozen, as if a part of himself had long suspected this truth, but feared its arrival. "On the night you were conceived," Aethra continued, "your father placed beneath this stone 2 gifts, a sword and a pair of sandals. He told me that if his child were a son, and if that son grew to be strong and noble, he should come here and lift the stone. If he succeeds, he is to take what lies beneath and journey to Athens. There, he will meet the man who shares his blood." Theseus stepped forward. His hands did not tremble. His breath was steady. He looked down at the great stone, covered with moss and time, and knew that this was not merely a test of strength. It was a door, a passage into something far older, far deeper than anything he had yet known. With a deep breath, he crouched low and gripped the edges of the stone. The earth beneath him seemed to hold its breath, and then he pulled. Muscles strained, veins surged, and the air shimmered with energy. Slowly, with the sound of roots tearing and stone grating against stone, the slab rose. Beneath it lay a shallow hollow in the earth, and in it gleamed a sword with a golden hilt, and beside it a pair of fine leather sandals untouched by decay. Aethra stepped back, her eyes shimmering with pride and sorrow. She knew what this meant. Theseus lifted the sword. It felt like it belonged to him, light, familiar, eager. The sandals were soft but sturdy, made for journeys no ordinary man could survive. The time had come, but the path to Athens was not to be a path of ease. Theseus, the wise old king, offered Theseus a ship swift and manned by the finest sailors of Troezen. It was the safest way to travel. The sea, after all, was the domain of Poseidon, and surely he would watch over his son. But Theseus refused. "If I am to meet my father," he said, "then let me meet him, not as a boy who was delivered, but as a man who endured. I will go by land, not by sea, and let every danger along the way be proof of who I am." Aethra tried to persuade him. She knew of the perils that lay on the roads between Troezen and Athens, bandits, monsters, and worse. But Theseus would not be swayed. The sword of Aegeus hung at his side, and something ancient stirred in his blood. And so, at dawn, Theseus began his journey. The sun rose like a flaming omen over the hills, casting long shadows that seemed to bow before the young warrior. Villagers gathered to watch him depart, whispering of omens and prophecies. Aethra watched him until he disappeared into the horizon. Her hands clasped tightly over her chest as though trying to hold his heartbeat within her own. Theseus walked with purpose, unaware that his journey would soon become legend, unaware that he would face men who murdered for sport creatures born of chaos and challenges crafted by the gods themselves, unaware that Athens, his true home, waited for him not with open arms but with secrets, betrayal, and a throne that might yet reject him. But for now he walked with the rising sun on his shoulders and the wind at his back, guided by the silence of a mother's prayer and the weight of a destiny carved in stone. He was no longer just a boy from Troezen. He was Theseus, bearer of Aegeus's blade, and the path ahead would be written in blood, fire, and legend. The trials of young Theseus. The sun was a relentless sentinel overhead as Theseus walked the rugged land roads between Troezen and Athens roads, not often chosen and for good reason. Where others feared the wilderness, Theseus embraced it. Where others fled from danger, he walked toward it as if led by something greater than courage, fate, perhaps, or the ancient whisper of the gods in his blood. He wore no armor, save for the sword of Aegeus and the resolve in his heart. He could have taken the sea easy and swift, but he had made a vow to prove his worth, not only to his father, but to himself. The journey began in quiet, the creak of trees, the distant howl of wolves, and the crunch of dry earth beneath his feet. But peace, like all illusions, was short-lived. Sinis, the pine bender. The first of his trials awaited at the Isthmus of Corinth, a stretch of land where travelers often vanished and corpses swung from trees like grim fruit. There dwelled Sinis the pine bender, a brute of impossible strength, who had made the woods his kingdom of terror. Sinis had a game. He would bind travelers to the tips of two pine trees bent low and tethered to the ground. Then he would release them, letting the trees snap upward, tearing his victims limb from limb. To Sinis, death was a jest, a scream, a fleeting thrill. When Theseus met him, the monster smiled. "Well, what have we here? Another fool with a sword and no name." Theseus said nothing. Sinis lunged, but Theseus was quicker. Steel met bone, muscle met fury. They fought beneath the trees that had witnessed countless murders, and the branches groaned as if remembering. But this time, Sinis fell, and Theseus, turning justice upon its architect, tied the giant to his own pines and let the trees sing. They snapped upward. The forest shuddered, and Sinis the pine bender was no more. Word of it traveled like wind over fire. "A stranger walks the wild roads," people whispered. "A youth with a hero's gaze, and death in his wake." But Theseus did not seek praise. He sought passage, the soul of Crommyon. Beyond the isthmus lay Crommyon, a place plagued not by men but by a beast, Phaya, a monstrous sow, born of Typhon's brood and reared by a crone in the hills. No sword had pierced its hide. No trap had held its bulk. Farmers wept, families fled, and crops lay trampled beneath cloven feet. When Theseus came, the beast was waiting as though it too had heard of him. It charged from the thickets like a thunderstorm of flesh and tusk. But Theseus did not retreat. He stood eyes unblinking and met the charge head on. With a swift motion he leapt, rolled beneath its girth, and drove his blade deep beneath its chin. Blood soaked the earth. The villagers emerged from hiding, awestruck. Theseus asked no reward. He simply nodded and walked on. He was a storm passing through cleansing wild and unyielding, Cyrn the footwasher. Next came the cliffs of Megara, jagged and steep, where the bandit Siren made his dwelling. Siren was not like Sinis. He did not rely on brute strength, but deception. He would offer weary travelers rest, food, water, and a chance to wash the dust from their feet. But once they knelt, he would kick them over the cliff, where a monstrous turtle awaited in the waters below, always hungry. When Theseus approached, Siren smiled with feigned hospitality. "Come, brave one, rest your feet, wash away the road." Theseus saw through the mask. "I prefer to stand," he replied. Then as Siren lunged, Theseus stepped aside, seized him and hurled the bandit over the edge. The turtle did not wait. The circle was complete. No longer did Theseus merely survive. He began to cleanse the land, purging it of rot. He did not know it, but the people of Athens were beginning to speak his name in the same breath as Heracles. A new hero walked among them. Cercyon, the wrestler. In Eleusis, the path led Theseus to another trial. Cercyon, the mad wrestler king. No one passed through his lands without a contest of strength. He would challenge men to wrestle, crush their bones against the earth, and leave their corpses as offerings to his pride. Theseus accepted without hesitation. They stood in the dust of a cracked arena, and Cercyon laughed at the slender youth before him. But what Cercyon did not understand was that Theseus fought not only with strength, but with mind. He studied his opponent's rhythm, the way he leaned, the moments when rage clouded his focus. And then, like a sudden storm, Theseus struck. He used the giant's own momentum, turned it against him, and with a final thundering throw, dashed Cercyon's body to the earth. It was not just a victory of flesh, it was a triumph of wisdom over arrogance. The people of Eleusis emerged from behind doors and trees, watching in awe. For the first time in years, the land was free. Theseus moved on, never looking back. He was not yet finished. Procrustes, the stretcher near the hills of Arenaeus, just before the final road to Athens, lay a house, innocent in appearance, clean, welcoming. But inside lived Procrustes, the most twisted of all. He had 2 beds, one long, one short. When travelers sought shelter, he would make them fit the bed. If they were too short, he would stretch them. If they were too tall, he would cut them down. He called it equality. When Theseus arrived, Procrustes grinned. "Come in, noble one. You look tired. Let me give you rest." Theseus smiled, and as the door closed behind him, the sword of Aegeus flashed. The house did not see another victim. The beds were burned, the walls torn down. Justice had been served by the blade, and by the will of a prince, unknown to his father. Toward Athens now, Theseus stood at the edge of Attica. His body bore bruises, his clothes the dust of battle. But his eyes blazed like starlight, bright with victory, heavy with what he had seen. Each trial had not only tested his strength, but chiseled him, removing the softness of youth, revealing the steel of manhood beneath. He had cleansed the land, avenged the fallen, walked where others dared not. But he was not done. Beyond the hills, Athens awaited, the city of his blood, the throne of his father. And yet he would not arrive to cheers. Not yet. Not as a son welcomed home, but as a stranger watched with suspicion. For danger still waited. In the palace of Aegeus, a woman stirred. A queen, not his mother. A sorceress with eyes like frost Medea. She saw omens in the stars. She knew the boy was coming, and she would not let him take what she had claimed. But Theseus did not know this. Not yet. He only knew the road had ended, and the truth, whatever it was, lay ahead. The journey of perils. The sun dipped lower behind the Athenian hills, casting long golden fingers across the marble columns of a city both ancient and proud. Athens, the cradle of wisdom, the forge of heroes, and the seat of a throne Theseus had never seen. To others it was a city of democracy and philosophers, but to Theseus it was a city of answers, and perhaps, if the fates willed it, a city of belonging. But cities like men wear masks, and behind the shining beauty of Athens lurked shadows none darker than the sorceress who now ruled beside King Aegeus. Medea, once the wife of Jason, once the wielder of divine knowledge and dark vengeance. She had fled Corinth after bloodshed too great for even the gods to ignore. She arrived in Athens under a new moon, and with her came omens, barrenness in the olive groves, wolves in the valleys, and a silence among birds. Still Aegeus, aging and weary, found solace in her cunning. She spoke of prophecy, of protecting the throne. She whispered of heirs and hidden dangers, and so the king let her stay, let her advise, let her weave her web in the royal court, and she saw it before anyone else, the storm approaching on sandaled feet. Theseus had entered the city not with fanfare, but in quiet observation. He wore no crest, no emblem of lineage. His sword was sheathed, his head unbowed. He walked among potters, fishmongers, and priests, listening to the rhythms of a city that was his by blood, but foreign by experience. He noticed the guards, how they lingered at corners. He saw the way common folk looked over their shoulders. There was tension in the streets, like a string pulled taut, ready to snap. Unbeknownst to him, Medea's spies were already watching. It didn't take long for word to reach her chamber. A young warrior had arrived, strong unknown and already gathering whispers among the people. He had the look of royalty. She acted quickly. In the inner sanctum of the palace, where incense clung to the walls and mirrors, warped the faces of those who looked too closely. Medea met with the king. Aegeus sat beneath the banner of his house, his eyes dimmed with years, his posture heavy with time. His once golden hair had turned to ash, and his crown rested lightly, perhaps too lightly, on his troubled brow. Sire, Medea spoke with honeyed tones, there is danger in the city. Aegeus looked up slowly. A stranger walks among us, a warrior of charm and mystery. Already the people speak his name. What name? Aegeus asked, his voice worn like parchment. They call him Theseus. Aegeus stirred, but only faintly. The name sparked something deep, buried, forgotten. Medea leaned closer, her eyes like polished obsidian. He may be here to claim your throne. The words pierced like poison. Medea knew that to defeat a hero, you must make him invisible, erase him before he is ever seen. And so she made a plan. Theseus, she said sweetly, should be welcomed. Let us honor him with a feast, as is custom. A cup of wine, a token of respect. And should the gods not favor him, well, the wine will take care of what fate began. Aegeus, lost in doubt and dread, nodded. Do what you must. Meanwhile, Theseus had made his way to the gates of the palace, not to claim a throne, but to meet a man. His father. A face from stories, from riddles and dreams. He walked past the marble lions that guarded the entrance, unaware that fate had already set its trap. The hall inside was silent, too silent. Torches flickered. Musicians played soft, droning tunes. and at the center of the marble floor stood a table set for a single guest. Medea stood beside it, her robes shimmering like starlight, spun from spider silk. "Welcome, stranger," she said. "The king of Athens bids you rest. Eat, drink. You must be weary from your journey." Theseus bowed politely. He noticed the way her eyes never blinked. Aegeus sat nearby, watching with dull curiosity. He said nothing at first, just stared. Medea handed Theseus a goblet filled with crimson wine. "Theseus of Troezen," she said, "let Athens be your home if only for a moment." But before the cup could reach his lips, something happened. The flicker of a torch, a glint of gold in the low light. Aegeus saw at the hilt of the sword hanging from Theseus's side. The shape, the design, the very same sword he had buried beneath the stone so many years ago. His heart stilled. "Wait," he whispered. The goblet froze in Theseus's hand. Aegeus rose from his throne, suddenly younger, fiercer, as if the years had shed from his bones. "Where did you get that sword?" he asked. Theseus lowered the cup and looked the king in the eyes. "I lifted it from beneath a stone in Troezen," he said. "My mother said it was left by a man who once came seeking prophecy." Aegeus stepped forward, his breath catching. "Your mother? What is her name?" Theseus said simply, and in that instant the illusion broke. Aegeus cried out not in pain, but in joy. He rushed forward, embraced the youth, and wept into his shoulder. "My son," he gasped. "My son." The court erupted. Servants dropped trays. Musicians froze mid-note. Even Medea paled. She had failed. The truth could not be silenced now, and as the king embraced his long-lost heir, Medea vanished, some say, through a secret passage. Others say by magic itself, her schemes crumbling like old parchment. That night Athens celebrated, but Theseus did not smile easily. For though he had found his father, and his name was now known, he felt the storm was only just beginning. There was still Crete. There was still the Minotaur. And there was still the burden of being a hero, not in name, but in consequence. The sun meets the king. The dawn after the feast in Athens was unlike any other. The streets were thick with incense and laughter. Musicians played lyres beneath marble arches. Vendors gave away olives and honeyed figs to passing children, and old men whispered to one another, "He has returned. The king's son lives." But inside the palace, beyond the laughter and the golden light, the truth of Athens waited like a silent curse, coiled beneath stone. Theseus stood at the edge of the great throne hall, gazing down at the people from the high terrace. They were strangers, his people now, but unknown to him. He watched them with an emotion he did not fully understand. Not joy, not pride, but a flicker of burden. Behind him, the footsteps of King Aegeus echoed faintly on the polished marble. There was something weary in his gait, even now, even after the embrace of blood and the miracle of reunion. The king stood beside his son and looked down upon the city he had ruled for decades. "It is beautiful," Theseus said softly. "It is broken," Aegeus replied, his voice far away. "And I have done little to mend it." Theseus turned to him. "What do you mean?" Aegeus took a long breath. "You were not here, Theseus, when the last black-sailed ship left Athens. You did not hear the mother's cry or see the father's collapse in the streets. You did not feel the silence that comes when a city watches its children disappear into the sea." He turned and walked slowly toward the throne, the hem of his robe whispering across the floor. Theseus followed. "There is something you must know," Aegeus said. "Something that has cursed us for years. something that was born not of the gods, but of guilt. And so the king began to speak not as a ruler, but as a man burdened by memory. Years ago, Aegeus had sent his nephew Androgeos to Crete as a symbol of peace. A brilliant youth, beloved and strong, Androgeos won every contest at the Cretan Games. But his victories bred envy among the Athenian nobles, dark-hearted men who feared the boy's fame. In secret they plotted. One night they sent him into the hills to slay a monstrous bull, a creature that had already taken many lives. It was a test they knew he would not survive. Androgeos never returned. When news reached King Minos of Crete, father of Androgeos, his rage knew no limits. He called for war, and Athens, too weak to resist, bowed its head. Aegeus, in despair, offered tribute. To appease Minos' wrath and end the bloodshed, Athens agreed to a cruel pact every 9 years. 7 young men and 7 maidens would be sent to Crete to be fed to the Minotaur. The Labyrinth awaited them, an endless maze of stone and shadow, built by Daedalus himself. Inside it dwelled the Minotaur, half man, half beast, born of blasphemy and rage. None had ever returned. The king fell silent. Theseus stood still, his hands clenched at his sides. And now Aegeus whispered, "The time has come again. The Cretans arrive in 3 days to take our children. The air between them trembled, and you do nothing." Theseus asked quietly, but his voice held a sharp edge. Aegeus raised his eyes. "What would you have me do? Raise a sword against Crete, and doom our people to war?" The last king who defied Minos watched his city burn to the ground. "I have kept Athens alive, Theseus, even if it meant feeding it to the beast." But Theseus did not move. He stepped forward, his voice low, but unshakable. "Then let me go." Aegeus stared at him. "What?" "I will go with the tribute," Theseus said. "I will enter the labyrinth. I will face the Minotaur, and I will end this." The king's face paled. "No," he said. "You are my son. You are my legacy." "I am your son," Theseus answered, "and that is why I must go. What is a prince if not a shield for his people? But the Minotaur," Aegeus whispered, "no one survives. Theseus will." There was silence. Then slowly, the king rose from his throne and placed a hand upon his son's shoulder. "If you go," he said, voice quivering, "promise me one thing." Theseus nodded. "When you return, if you return, change the sails. Our ships leave with black sails in mourning. But if you survive, raise white sails. Let me know you are alive before I see your face." Theseus met his father's eyes. "I swear it." That night the city hummed with whispers. Some called Theseus mad. Others called him the hero of prophecy. Children tied white cloths to sticks and waved them from their windows. And on the 3rd day, as the Cretan emissaries stood in the port, their black robes shimmering like oil in the sun, Theseus stepped aboard the tribute ship without hesitation. 7 young men, 7 young women, and 1 prince who had chosen his fate. As the ship pulled away, Aegeus stood high on the cliffs of Cape Sounio, his hand shielding his eyes from the sun, watching the sails shrink into the horizon. Black sails. They vanished slowly, swallowed by the sea and the sky. And he prayed. What lay ahead was Crete, the Labyrinth, the Minotaur. But what Theseus could not yet know was that fate had placed another piece on the board, a thread not of war, but of love, a thread spun by Ariadne, daughter of Minos, watcher of stars. And somewhere beneath the stone halls of Knossos, the beast stirred, the tribute to Crete. The sea stretched endlessly beneath the ship, black as obsidian, and breathing in slow, deep swells like the lungs of some ancient god. The air was thick with salt and silence. No one sang, no one spoke. 14 souls sat upon the deck, 7 young men, 7 maidens, all bound for death. Only Theseus stood tall. He moved among them, speaking quietly, offering courage where none had taken root. Some wept in secret. Others stared blankly at the waves. Theseus did not offer false hope. He told them the truth that the path ahead was dark, but he would walk it with them, sword drawn, heart steady. None knew yet that the beast within the labyrinth would face a hunter. The voyage took days, each dawn darker than the last. As they neared the shores of Crete, the sky itself seemed to weigh heavier, and the sea narrowed into the great harbor of Knossos, where the city rose like a myth brought to life. Marble columns gleamed like bones beneath the sun. Crimson banners fluttered from golden towers. Statues of bulls and kings stood tall, their faces cruel and immortal. It was a land of beauty and shadow where civilization wrapped its elegance around the bones of ancient sacrifice. At the docks, King Minos awaited. Tall, weathered with a crown that looked carved from bloodstone, Minos did not greet his captives with anger, but indifference. To him this was tradition, a ritual, a promise paid in flesh. He looked at the young Athenians with a gaze that had long forgotten grief. But when his eyes fell on Theseus, he paused. "You are not like the others," he said. "I am not," Theseus answered. "You came willingly." "I did." Minos studied him. "You'll die just the same." Theseus said nothing, but someone else was watching. Hidden among the priestesses and attendants stood a woman with eyes like wildfire caught in wine, Ariadne, daughter of Minos, princess of Crete. She saw him. She saw not a tribute, but a man carved from prophecy, not a lamb to the slaughter, but a lion beneath the skin. And in that moment, something ancient stirred within her, something defiant. That night, as the Athenians were locked within the holding chambers beneath the palace, Ariadne stole away from her rooms. Cloaked in shadow, she passed the guards like a whisper and entered the prison. Theseus sat alone, eyes closed, sword hidden beneath a cloth. When he opened his eyes, she stood before him. "You're the one," she said. He stood slowly. "The one for what?" "The one who might end it." Ariadne came closer, her voice barely above the sound of her own breath. "The labyrinth has no end, no light, no sky, no way out. My father says it is justice, but I see only blood. You are not meant to die in there." "I came to kill the beast," Theseus said. "I do not fear the dark." She smiled sadly. "You will." Then she reached into her robe and pulled out a small spool of golden thread. It shimmered in the dim torchlight, like woven sunlight. "Take this," she said. "Tie it at the entrance of the labyrinth. Let it unspool behind you as you walk. It is spun from divine silk. It will not tangle. It will not break. If you survive, it will lead you out." Theseus took it, his fingers brushing hers. "Why help me?" "Because I believe the gods sent you here," she whispered. "And because I do not want to live in a world where this continues." There was silence between them. Then quietly she added, "If you survive, take me with you. Promise me." Theseus looked at her, seeing not just beauty, but fire, rebellion, and sorrow. "I swear it." Ariadne vanished before the guards returned. The next morning the prisoners were taken from their cells. Dressed in ceremonial robes, they were marched through the grand corridors of Knossos. past murals of bulls trampling men, past frescoes of serpents and kings. At the edge of the palace grounds, where stone met shadow, stood the mouth of the labyrinth. It was not a door, but a wound, an opening in the earth low and wide, lined with bones and silence. The high priest stepped forward and made the final chant, offering the youths to the beast within. The guards said nothing as they pushed them in one by one into the darkness. Theseus was the last to enter. He turned once and looked back at the blue sky, at the sun, at the world he might never see again. And then without a word he descended into the mouth of the labyrinth, the golden thread tied tightly to the first stone. Inside, the world changed. The air grew damp and cold. The walls breathed. The corridors bent and twisted like the insides of a living thing. There was no pattern, no map, only silence broken by distant inhuman sounds. The other Athenians scattered. Panic overtook some. Others collapsed in despair. But Theseus moved steadily. He let the thread unspool behind him, winding through the corridors, sword drawn, footsteps silent. He passed old bones, scratches on the wall. A scream far away, then silence again. Time lost meaning. Was it hours, days? Then at last he heard it, breathing, deep, slow, heavy, like a furnace beneath the earth. And there in a wide chamber, lit only by bioluminescent moss and a trickle of glowing water, he saw it, the Minotaur, towering, hulking, half man, half beast, muscles like carved stone, eyes glowing red beneath twisted horns. Its breath steamed in the cold air. Blood matted its claws. It turned, sniffing, sensing. Then it roared, and the chamber shook. Theseus gripped his sword. The gods were watching. Labyrinth and the beast. The roar of the Minotaur echoed through the twisted halls of the labyrinth, rising like thunder from the belly of the world. Walls shuddered. Stones trembled. Even the dark itself seemed to flinch at the sound. And Theseus stood still. He did not flinch. He did not falter. The golden thread unspooled behind him like fate's own breath, shimmered faintly in the gloom. In his right hand, the sword of Aegeus gleamed, no longer the token of a forgotten birthright, but the weapon of a man chosen by destiny. Across the chamber, the Minotaur lowered its horned head. A silence fell, brief, suspended. Then the beast charged. Its hooves thundered against the stone floor, muscles rippling beneath matted fur. The very air screamed as the monster barreled forward, a juggernaut of rage and hunger. Theseus waited, and just before the impact, he dove. The Minotaur smashed into the wall behind him, stone crumbling like dry bread. Dust choked the air. The beast roared again, turning with startling speed, swiping its clawed hand toward Theseus. The blade met flesh, a shallow wound. The Minotaur bellowed in pain and fury, striking again, faster, now smarter. It was not just a brute, it was ancient cunning and cruel. They fought like titans in the dark. The clash echoed through the labyrinth, steel against bone, roar against roar. Theseus ducked, rolled, slashed. The Minotaur's breath was hot and foul, its fists like falling stars. Each blow that missed left cracks in the walls. But Theseus was not here to survive. He was here to end it. He struck low, slicing the tendons of one leg. The beast stumbled. With a cry, it swung wide, knocking Theseus off balance. His sword fell from his grip, clattering across the stone floor. The Minotaur saw its chance. It lunged. But Theseus was faster. He reached for the fallen sword, rolled beneath the monster's bulk, and drove the blade deep into its chest, through muscle, through rib, through the dark heart that had beat for blood since the day of its birth. The beast froze. Its breath came in one last tortured gasp, and then silence. The Minotaur collapsed its weight, shaking the floor, its blood pooling black beneath it. The roar that had haunted Athens for years died in the hollow echo of its death. Theseus knelt beside it, his chest heaving. It was done. The curse was broken. But the labyrinth was not finished. Its halls still twisted. Its paths still whispered madness. The beast may have been slain, but the maze was alive. Without the thread, Theseus knew he would vanish like so many before him. He turned following the shimmering trail of Ariadne's gift. Step by step, he retraced his path. Left turn, right, a fork, a slope. Time passed, or perhaps stopped. It was impossible to know. Only the thread remained true, shining gold in the dark, leading him back to life. Finally light, a crack of morning above a stone stair, the scent of wind, a whisper of freedom. Theseus emerged into the sunlight, eyes blinking, body covered in dust and blood. The guards at the mouth of the labyrinth dropped their weapons in awe. He was alone, but he was alive, and the Minotaur was dead. Atop the palace tower, Ariadne waited. She had not slept. She had not eaten. Every hour she had watched the sky, every minute, fearing that her thread would return, but Theseus would not. And then she saw him, bloody, bruised, glorious. She ran to him before the others could react. Their hands found each other, like the meeting of wind and fire. "You kept your promise," she whispered. "You saved my life," he replied. Before Minos could act, before his fury could rise, Theseus and Ariadne fled the palace. With the help of loyal servants who despised the beast and the king, they stole away to the docks. The black-sailed ship still waited, and before the sun reached its peak, it slipped away into the open sea, leaving the Cretan shore and its shadows behind. That night under the stars, Theseus sat beside Ariadne on the deck of the ship. "Do you regret it?" he asked. She looked at him, her eyes soft. Leaving a prison is not something one regrets. He took her hand. They had escaped a monster, defied a kingdom, broken a curse. But the gods were not yet finished with their tale. The Aegean stretched out before them, wide, endless, and watching, and the sails above them still black. The forgotten sails. The sea was calm. For the first time in days, the wind whispered rather than screamed, and the waves lapped gently against the hull of the black-sailed ship as it cut its way through the Aegean. Above, stars turned slowly like the eyes of gods, and the moon poured silver across the surface of the water. Theseus stood at the prow of the ship, staring into the horizon. He was no longer just a prince, nor simply a warrior. He had slain a beast born of shadow and legend, saved his people from a decade-long nightmare, and won the heart of a princess. And yet his soul was not at peace. Behind him, wrapped in a woolen cloak against the sea breeze, Ariadne sat with her knees pulled to her chest, watching the stars in silence. The moonlight shimmered in her hair, but her eyes held questions she could not yet ask. They had escaped Crete, but not cleanly. They had fled in haste. The bodies of Cretan guards lay behind them. The anger of King Minos would echo for generations. And Daedalus, the builder of the labyrinth, had vanished, perhaps imprisoned, perhaps worse. Now the sea carried them not only away from danger, but toward uncertainty. Athens lay ahead, a kingdom Theseus barely knew, a father he had met but once, a throne that might not welcome a foreign princess with Cretan blood, and a legacy tied to the beast that haunted their nightmares. And Ariadne knew this. She had asked him once on the second night of their voyage if there would be a place for her in his new world. Theseus had smiled and kissed her fingers. "There will always be a place beside me." But as the ship pressed farther across the open sea and the stars began to fade into the first light of dawn, doubt crept in like mist. On the 7th day of their voyage, they came upon an island, a quiet, secluded haven known to sailors as Naxos. Its beaches were soft with pale sand, its forests rich with fruit and game. The sailors, exhausted from the journey and fearing storms ahead, begged for a short respite. Theseus agreed. They anchored in a cove, hidden from prying eyes, and made camp among the palms. Ariadne wandered the beach barefoot, her laughter soft as the tide. And for a moment, Theseus allowed himself to imagine a different life, one not built upon blood and prophecy, but love and stillness. They spent the evening beneath the stars' arms, intertwined hearts, beating in shared rhythm. She spoke of dreams, of places she had never seen, of quiet mornings and children yet unborn. Theseus listened, but his eyes wandered to the horizon. That night, as she slept in his arms, Theseus rose. He walked alone down the beach, the sword of Aegeus at his hip, his face carved by thought. He had made a promise, but promises he now realized were easy to make when death was near, harder to keep when kingdoms waited. Could he bring Ariadne to Athens? Would the people of his city accept her? Would the nobles embrace the daughter of their former enemy? Would Aegeus? Theseus was a man of purpose, of justice. But in that moment he became something else, a son afraid to return home as a stranger, a prince afraid to challenge his court. And so, as the sky paled into morning, he made a decision. Before the others woke, he ordered the ship to prepare for departure. Ariadne slept still, the fire beside her cold. Theseus did not wake her. He left her there beneath the soft trees of Naxos, her dreams unbroken, her heart unaware. The ship slipped away like a thief in the early light, and Ariadne was alone. They say the gods watched from above, and one of them, Dionysus, lord of wine and madness, took pity on her. He found her wandering the sands, eyes wide with grief, her cries swallowed by the wind. He lifted her from sorrow, made her his bride, and crowned her with a wreath of stars. But Theseus did not know this. He sat at the helm of his ship, staring forward in silence, his hands resting on his knees. Athens rose before them like a dream carved from stone. Cape Sounio shimmered in the morning haze. The city would soon see him again. The people would rejoice. And on the cliffs above, King Aegeus stood waiting. His eyes scanned the horizon. His breath held, but above the ship no white sails flew, only black, and the sea old and knowing began to stir. The fall of King Aegeus. The cliffs of Cape Sounio were silent, but for the wind, high cold and endless. Far below, the waves crashed against the jagged rocks, like drums of war, their white crests curling and breaking as though the sea itself grieved something long foretold. There at the very edge of the stone stood King Aegeus. He had not moved in hours. Each day since the tribute ship had vanished into the eastern horizon, Aegeus had come here to this cliff, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes never leaving the sea. He no longer slept. He no longer spoke much even to his advisors. He watched. He waited. He remembered. He remembered the sword he had buried beneath the stone. He remembered the sun who had appeared like a miracle, only to vanish again, offering himself to a beast no one had ever escaped. But most of all, he remembered the promise. If you survive, raise white sails. Those words had become his prayer, his hope, his lifeline. And then one morning the sailor's cry came from the watchtower. A ship, a black-sailed ship. The world collapsed in his chest. Aegeus stepped forward, his sandals scraping the very edge of the cliff. His heart pounded like a war drum. The salt in the air stung his eyes, but he could not look away. Far below, slicing through the mist like a shadow reborn, came the vessel. Athens' tribute ship, the same ship he had watched disappear days ago. And above its mast, a black sail billowed in the wind. No white, no signal of life, only mourning, only death. Aegeus's lips parted, no sound came out. For a moment the world tilted, the wind became louder. Or perhaps it was only the roar in his ears. His knees trembled beneath the weight of a truth he had never wanted to see. His son, his Theseus, was dead. He had faced the Minotaur and failed. The black sail had spoken it plainly, and in that moment all the strength left him. His shoulders sagged. His crown slipped slightly on his head. The cliffs offered no comfort, no explanation, only finality. And so without a word, without a farewell, Aegeus stepped forward. His robe caught the wind like wings, and the king of Athens fell silent, graceful broken from the rocks of Sounio into the sea below. They say the sea held him gently. They say the waves cradled him as a father might cradle a child. They say he did not cry out, and ever since that day the waters surrounding the land he once ruled have borne his name. The Aegean Sea. Hours later the ship docked. Theseus stood tall, weary but victorious. The people of Athens flooded the port, cheering, crying, throwing flowers at his feet. The tribute had returned. The Minotaur was no more, but there was no celebration in his eyes. As he stepped into the palace, the air was wrong. The servants wept in corners. The guards stood at solemn attention, and on the throne, no one sat. It did not take long for the truth to reach him. Aegeus was gone. The sails had remained black. He had forgotten. In the chaos of escape, in the sorrow of abandoning Ariadne, in the haze of victory and salt and sleep, he had forgotten. The sword slipped from his hand. The weight of guilt fell upon his shoulders like stone. He had returned with life, but he had brought death all the same. That night no songs were sung in the halls of Athens. Only the sea sang, and it sang of sorrow. And Theseus, the hero, the prince, the slayer of monsters, sat in his father's throne alone with a crown he did not yet want, and a silence that would echo for years, the rise of a king. The halls of Athens were draped in black. Where once hung banners of gold and blue, now solemn cloths lined the columns. The torches that burned through the night gave no warmth, only flickering reminders of absence. The people spoke in hushed voices, and the city, though victorious, mourned. The monster had fallen, but so had the king. Theseus, son of Aegeus, now sat upon a throne still warm from his father's touch, not as a conqueror, not even as a savior, but as a man hollowed by guilt. He had killed the Minotaur. He had freed his people from a cruel cycle of sacrifice. He had crossed seas and slain beasts and emerged from the labyrinth alive. But he had also left behind Ariadne, and he had forgotten the sails. That single moment, that thin fluttering cloth, had cost him everything he had longed for. A father's embrace, a future shared, forgiveness. The weight of the crown was immense. The city, though, did not crumble. Athens looked to Theseus with hope. He had proven himself not in words, but in deeds. He had chosen the harder path, walking the land from Troezen to Athens, cleansing the roads of monsters and thieves. He had offered himself in place of others, not knowing if he would return. And now, though his shoulders were bowed with grief, the people saw in him the fire of kings. The council approached him days after the funeral of Aegeus' robes, rustling scrolls in hand. "You must lead us now," they said. "Athens needs a king." But Theseus was slow to answer. He wandered the palace gardens for hours each day, silent among the olive trees. He sat alone at the cliffs of Sounio, where his father had fallen, speaking to the sea. Some said they saw him whispering to the waves, begging forgiveness. Others said he simply watched, never moving, never blinking, waiting for the sea to offer a sign. At last, on the 7th day, he returned to the throne room. He wore no crown, but he stood tall. "If I am to be king," he said, "then Athens will change." And so it did. Theseus began to rebuild Athens not only in stone, but in spirit. He united the scattered villages of Attica into a single nation bound not by fear, but by shared strength. He established laws, festivals, and councils, allowing voices beyond nobility to be heard. He laid the foundation of democracy, though the word itself would not be spoken for generations. He called upon artisans, scholars, and poets. Temples rose, agora bloomed with debate. The youth were trained in both mind and muscle, and above all, he outlawed the tribute to Crete, forever sealing that dark chapter in Athens' history. Under his rule, Athens flourished. Yet Theseus never truly celebrated. The ghost of Aegeus lingered in every marble pillar. The silence of Ariadne followed him through every corridor. He never married again. Some said he returned to Naxos once alone, searching the shores for the woman he had abandoned. But she was gone, taken by the gods. Years passed. Myths grew around him. The slayer of the Minotaur, the uniter of Attica, the man who tamed the roads and walked into death and returned. But those who truly knew him, those few who stood by his side in silence, knew that his crown was forged from loss, not gold. And one day, like all kings, Theseus too vanished from the world. Some say he was cast into exile. Others claim he was betrayed. But many believe that near the very cliff from which his father fell, Theseus walked once more to the edge and disappeared into the wind, returning to the sea that had claimed Aegeus before him. And the sea remembers. It bears their names. It whispers their story. The tale of a father and a son, of monsters and mazes, of glory, guilt, and legacy. And when the waves crash against the cliffs of Sounio, it is not just wind and water you hear, but a legend rising once more. The legend of King Aegeus, the legacy of Theseus, and the eternal breath of the Aegean Sea. Shadows of the past, in the time before Athens wore her white stones and silver laurels, when the gods still walked like dreams among men. There lived a king with sorrow behind his eyes, and a burden heavy upon his city. His name was Aegeus, ruler of Athens, but to the people he was known simply as the king of the black-sailed shore. For every few years, when the springtide turned cruel, and the moon hung low and swollen, the black-sailed ships of Crete would arrive silent and merciless. The people gathered in the great square, hearts clenched as 7 young men and 7 young women were chosen, not for glory, not for exile, for sacrifice. They were not chained nor beaten. That would be too kind. Instead, they were dressed in ceremonial white, kissed by their families, and led down to the docks like lambs, to a fate darker than death. No one dared speak the word, but all knew where they went, the Labyrinth, and what awaited them within. The story was old, older than even the olive trees atop the Acropolis. It began far across the sea in Crete in the palace of King Minos, whose voice could command storms and whose vengeance was long. Minos had once sent his son Androgeos, a golden-haired warrior favored by the gods, to compete in the games of Athens. He had triumphed perhaps too well. Some said he had bested the Athenian champions so thoroughly that their pride curdled into murder. Others whispered of darker things, a plotted ambush, a jealous curse. But only one thing was certain: Androgeos never returned home. Minos wept fire. With the wrath of Poseidon at his back, he laid siege to Athens not with swords, but with punishment more cruel. In penance, Athens was to send tribute, 14 youths pure and beautiful, to Crete. And there, in the stone heart of a twisted labyrinth, designed by Daedalus himself, the children were offered to the beast that should not exist, the Minotaur, half man, half bull, the monstrous child of a queen's sin and a god's insult. Trapped in a maze hidden from sun and sea, it lived only to devour what dared to breathe. Athens bled its youth every cycle, and Aegeus the king bled from within, for though he ruled, he could not save them. But there was one who could not bow to tradition, a boy with storm in his blood and fire in his eyes. His name was Theseus. The prince grew not in golden halls, but on stony hillsides, where wind howled like wolves, and truth was carved into stone. He trained with hunters, fought with feral strength, and listened not to songs of the gods, but to the cries of mourning mothers. He watched the third choosing. He saw the black-robed priests mark the shoulders of the chosen. He heard the silence in their screams, and he could bear it no more. One night, while Aegeus sat alone with his crown crooked and his goblet full of silence, Theseus entered the throne hall, eyes bright beneath unkempt hair. "Father," he said, his voice echoing through marble and memory, "I will go to Crete." Aegeus turned the goblet, slipping from his hand. "No, I will face the Minotaur." Theseus continued, "And I will end this." "You are my son," Aegeus whispered. "You are all I have left. Then let me be what Athens needs." The boy replied. There was silence, the kind that lives in mountains and graves. And then Aegeus stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the sea. The water was black and endless. "If you return," he said slowly, "hoist white sails, not black. I will," Theseus promised. "I swear it." But even oaths cannot promise fate. In the days that followed, Theseus trained with rage in his limbs. He sparred until his knuckles split, until his breath tore from his throat. He did not prepare for death. He prepared for victory. The people whispered of him, half in hope, half in fear. The ship waited at the docks, its black sails already raised. He stood among the other 13 tributes, no longer a prince, but a marked soul. And when the oars dipped into the water and the harbor fell away, Athens watched in silence, uncertain whether it was sending its savior or its last hope. Out at sea, dreams came harder. The children slept in piles, their eyes wide open behind closed lids. Some prayed, some wept, some sang songs they had heard as babes. Theseus did not sleep. He stood at the prow, hands tight on the rail eyes on the eastern horizon. He did not fear the monster. He feared the maze. A beast can be fought. But how do you fight a place that doesn't want you to leave? The legend said the labyrinth changed with every breath, that those inside lost not only their way, but themselves, that their names fell from their tongues, that even the gods could not see within. Theseus did not believe in gods, but he believed in death, and it wore the face of a bull. On the dawn of the fourth day, Crete rose from the mist like a carved jewel. White palaces clung to cliffs, terraced fields shimmered gold, and the great palace of Knossos loomed with pride and beauty and hidden pain. The tributes were greeted with fanfare, drums beat, dancers twirled. Minos stood at the gates in a robe of deep blue, his beard coiled like sea foam, his eyes sharp as blades. "Welcome," he said, and his voice was like stone, dragged across stone. "To the last days of your lives." Beside him stood a girl, her eyes downcast, her hands folded. She wore a dress of wine-red silk, and her hair fell in waves to her waist. Ariadne, daughter of Minos, daughter of the Labyrinth. But something flickered in her gaze as Theseus passed. A question, a crack in the pattern. And Theseus, ever the storm, saw her and did not look away. That night, as the children were led to the guest quarters, Ariadne walked the halls alone. She heard the sea pounding the rocks. She heard the whisper of fate curling through corridors. She had seen the others before, their terror, their silence. But this boy, this stranger, he looked at her not as a daughter of Crete, nor a gatekeeper to his death, but as something human. A spark danced inside her chest. Not love, not yet, but the sense that something long frozen had begun to thaw, and far beneath them in the dark corridors of ancient stone, something stirred. It felt the pulse of new blood in its maze. It tasted the fear, and it waited. The prince who refused fear. Morning in Knossos came not with silence, but with ceremony. Flutes cried softly beneath the rising sun, and the city bustled as if it did not stand on bones. Flower vendors filled baskets, priests burned oil in bronze basins, and guards polished their blades not for war, but for pride. The tributes were to be paraded dressed in silks, led through streets, a gift from Athens to Crete, beautifully wrapped for the slaughter. Theseus woke early. He did not bow, did not break. He knelt before no god that morning, only before his own reflection, sharpening a small blade behind his bootstrap. The others murmured prayers to Athena, to Apollo, to any who might spare them. But Theseus, he only murmured his name, not in arrogance, in remembrance. For a name is the first thing a labyrinth takes. When the procession began, the Athenian youths were led through the wide plazas of Knossos. Crowds gathered to marvel at the condemned. Petals rained down from balconies. Laughter curled from painted lips. To the Cretans this was tradition, a theater of power where blood played the final act. But the Athenians marched not with pride. They shuffled. They stared at the ground. All but one. Theseus walked with his head high, his gaze sweeping across the people like a blade across a whetstone. And as he walked, he saw her again, Ariadne. She stood beneath an archway, garlands at her feet, her hands clasped but shaking. Their eyes met. This time, she did not look away, and neither did he. Later, when the sun had bled gold across the horizon, and the tributes were locked in the stone barracks beneath the palace, Ariadne slipped through corridors lit by oil flame. Her footsteps were silent, but her breath was not. In her chest war waged between duty and rebellion, bloodline and choice. She had watched too many go to dim. Each time the maze devoured them. She had tried to forget, to close her heart, to wear the robes of a Cretan princess and smile beneath her painted mask. But this boy, he walked like a king. He looked like a question the gods had forgotten to answer, and in her hand, She held the answer. She reached the chamber door and hesitated. One knock, then two. The door creaked open. Theseus stood there, unsleeping eyes sharp. "I thought you might come," he said softly. "You should be afraid," she replied. "I am," he admitted, "but not of death." She stepped inside, closed the door behind her, and unwrapped a cloth bundle from beneath her robe. In it, a golden spool of thread, faintly warm, like it remembered sunlight. "This," she whispered, "is the only way out." Theseus took it reverently. "Ariadne's thread," he said. "That's what they'll call it." She blinked. "Who?" "Everyone. Someday." She almost smiled, almost. Then she told him how the labyrinth shifts, how its paths wind of their own will, how even Daedalus, its architect, once got lost within. But the thread, she said, is older than the maze, woven from the hair of the fates themselves. It remembers. It does not turn. Theseus tied it to his wrist. "And the beast?" he asked. She shuddered. "It is not a beast." "What is it then?" A pause. "It is what remains when rage cannot die." She turned to go, but he caught her hand gently. "Why help me?" She looked at him then, not as a princess, not as a pawn, but as a soul. "Because I want to believe in someone who doesn't bow to monsters." That night Theseus did not sleep. He sat beneath the high stone ceiling, staring at the thread, feeling its hum like a heartbeat, separate from his own. He thought of Athens, of his father, of the sea, and the sails and the promise he had made. But mostly he thought of her, Ariadne, the girl who lived in the shadow of the maze, but did not belong to it. And he made another silent vow: "I will not die in your father's cage." At dawn, the guards came. They unlocked the heavy iron door. The tributes were silent. Theseus rose first, the thread hidden in his tunic. No words were spoken. Words were for the living. They were led down past the banquet halls, the mosaic floors, the echoing chambers that once sang with music, down to the place where music died. The mouth of the labyrinth stood before them, an arch of carved black stone, gaping into blackness. No torches, no light, just a hole in the world. Minos stood beside it, arms crossed. The high priest uttered the rites. No one listened. A horn sounded, and the doors opened. One by one they entered. Theseus went last. He held the thread in his palm and tied one end to the entrance. Then, without ceremony, without prayer, he stepped into the dark. The door slammed shut behind him, and the silence swallowed the sun. The black sails to Crete. There are journeys shaped by storms, and there are journeys shaped by silence. The black-sailed ship that left Athens that morning made no noise, but for the groan of its hull and the soft slap of water against the oars. No laughter, no chanting, just the creak of a city's sorrow carried across the Aegean. Theseus stood at the prow. His hands rested on the wooden edge, but his mind drifted far beyond the horizon. Wind curled around him, salt tangling in his hair. Below the sea, whispered stories of those who had sailed before and never returned. Behind him, 13 others huddled near the mast, wrapped in cloaks and dread. None spoke to him. None dared. He was not like them. They felt it too. He bore no weight of fear, only the gravity of purpose. He had not come to die. He had come to kill a legend. From the distant hill of the Acropolis, King Aegeus had watched the ship vanish into the morning mist. His eyes, once sharp with wisdom, blurred as the horizon swallowed his son. "White sails," he had whispered. "White sails if you return." But Theseus hadn't looked back. There had been no room for farewell, only forward. The voyage to Crete took 7 days. Each day the sky grew bluer, the waves heavier, and the silence more unbearable. On the second night, a girl named Syra began to hum a soft tune from her childhood. Others listened, some with tears. On the third, a boy named Melon joined her, harmonizing with a voice that trembled. By the fifth night, all of them sang not with joy, but with memory, except Theseus. He listened, he watched, but he did not sing. On the sixth day, the island of Crete appeared like a mirage of white marble and red rooftops rising from the sea. The great palace of Knossos loomed high, its many towers like fingers stretching toward the sky. The labyrinth lay hidden within its belly, unseen yet always felt. It was said that the structure breathed, that stone shifted in its sleep, that screams went in and never came out. At sunset, the black-sailed ship docked in silence. The Cretans were waiting. The docks were lined with guards dressed in bronze and blue, their helmets shaped like snarling beasts. Behind them, citizens gathered in rows, eyes alight with curiosity, faces veiled in detachment. This was not mourning. This was spectacle. A trumpet sounded. "Welcome, noble tributes of Athens," said a voice laced with ceremony. It was Talos, the high herald of Minos, robed in gold and indifference. He gestured toward the marble steps leading up the hill toward the palace. King Minos awaits. The walk through Knossos was a corridor of contradictions. The city was radiant. Its streets polished, its columns painted with murals of dolphins and bulls, gods and dancers. And yet beneath every color lay the knowing silence of something dark. Every beauty was a veil over the blood beneath. The Athenians were led through towering halls into a throne chamber, bathed in torchlight and incense. There, seated upon a throne, carved from a single block of obsidian, sat Minos. He was not old, not yet, but time had carved him into something harder than stone. His eyes were cold tides, and his voice, when it came, was like waves breaking on a cliff. "Children of Athens," he said, "welcome to your final honor." Silence. None speak. He asked, a hint of amusement curling his lips. Still silence. Then Theseus stepped forward. "I speak." The court shifted. Guards tensed. "Your name?" Minos asked. "Theseus, son of Aegeus." Minos's eyes flickered. "Ah," he said, voice low. "So the king sends his own blood this time. Courage or desperation?" Just as Theseus replied, "For the blood you've spilled." A murmur rose among the Cretans. A guard took a step forward, but Minos lifted a hand. "Bravery looks good on the young," the king said, "but it rarely lasts in the dark." He rose slowly from his throne, stepped down the stairs, and stood eye to eye with the Athenian prince. "Let us see," Minos whispered, "if you speak so well when the walls start to whisper." Then he turned away. "Take them to the holding chamber. Tomorrow they enter the labyrinth." They were led down a spiraling stair through corridors carved of red stone and salt. The air grew colder, damper. Torches lined the walls, their flames casting flickers that looked like ghostly faces on the rock. Finally, they were locked into a large stone chamber. One torch, one doorway, no windows. It was not a prison. It was a waiting room or death. Theseus sat alone against the wall. His thoughts were not with the guards. They were with Ariadne. He had seen her briefly behind Minos's throne. She had stood motionless, her hands clenched, her lips pressed tight. Her eyes, though her eyes had searched for him. He wondered if she had heard his name, if she had remembered, if she would come. In the middle of the night, he awoke. Footsteps. Soft, measured, not armored. A shadow slipped into the chamber. A woman's form. Hooded. He rose slowly. Ariadne, he asked. She removed her hood. The torchlight painted her face in gold and sorrow. "You speak too loudly for one so close to dying," she said. "Then tell me how not to die." She stepped forward and handed him a bundle wrapped in linen, thread ancient, enchanted. "To lead me out, to lead you back," she corrected. "The labyrinth is alive. It listens. But the thread, it remembers the path." He nodded. "And the beast?" he asked. "Not a beast," she whispered. "A wound. One my father sealed in flesh and forgot." He looked at her then, not as a tool, not as a savior, but as someone bound by the same curse. "Will you wait for me?" he asked. She did not answer. She turned steps, vanishing into the dark. But just before the door closed, she whispered, "If you return, the world will change." Theseus sat in silence once more, the thread in his lap, the torch flickering beside him. Morning would come, and with it the labyrinth. Ariadne, daughter of the labyrinth. Crete was a kingdom built on secrets. Behind every painted wall and golden curtain lay another door, another whisper, another ancient oath not to be questioned. And among all those secrets, one had a name, Ariadne, the daughter of Minos, the thread between power and punishment, the heart of a palace that had forgotten how to feel. From the day she was born, Ariadne's fate was written not in the stars, but in stone. Her mother, Pasiphae, had once been beautiful, fierce, and defiant. But madness took root in her soul the day she bore the Minotaur, a child of divine mockery and mortal shame. Since then, Pasiphae had wandered the halls in silence, her hands always red with something unseen, her laughter echoing from rooms no one dared enter. Minos never spoke of his wife, and he never spoke of the child beneath the palace. But Ariadne knew. She heard the breathing in the floor at night. She felt the walls tremble when the beast stirred. She had walked the outer rings of the labyrinth, with Daedalus himself watched as the master craftsman drew blood into corridors and despair into stone. And she had learned one thing: the labyrinth never forgets. She was 13 when the first tribute arrived from Athens. 7 girls, 7 boys. She had stood beside her father, wearing a white veil and a ceremonial wreath. She was told to smile, but when she looked into the eyes of the Athenian children, she saw something no god had taught her to see: herself. Since then, she had kept count. 3 tributes, 42 names, 42 nightmares, and none had returned. But now there was Theseus. He had walked through Knossos like someone who belonged to no one. He had spoken to her with truth, not flattery. And when she had placed the spool of thread into his hand, she had felt something ancient stir, not in the gods above, not in the stones below, but in herself. That night she could not sleep. She wandered the gardens beneath a sky veiled in cloud. The moon tried to speak, but the stars would not listen. She thought of Theseus, and for the first time in her life, she hoped. Elsewhere in the palace, Minos drank wine that tasted like thunder. He stood upon his private balcony looking toward the east, where the labyrinth lay like a great coiled serpent sleeping beneath the city. His thoughts were not of his daughter. They were of Athens, of pride, of control. When the boy dies, he muttered to the wind, "Aegeus will break. Athens will bow." But the wind did not answer. The wind, like fate, had turned. At sunrise, the tributes were awakened by the guards of the moon gate, those sworn to guide the victims to the maze, and nothing more. They wore no helmets, no expressions, only the pale robes of sacred executioners. Each Athenian was marked with a symbol of fate painted in ash upon their forehead. When they reached the mouth of the labyrinth, the air grew colder. The gates groaned open, ancient hinges resisting the ritual. Theseus stood at the front. In his hand was Ariadne's thread, now tied to the archway behind him. The golden fiber shimmered faintly, pulsing with something older than time. The guards said nothing. They simply pointed into the dark. Theseus turned to look at Ariadne one last time. She stood beside her father, veil lifted. Her eyes did not blink. Her lips did not tremble. But when he looked at her, he saw the way out, not just of the labyrinth, but of fate itself. And then he turned and walked into the dark. Ariadne did not watch the others enter. She turned and fled the chamber before the gates slammed shut. She ran through corridors she had memorized as a child, past columns and silks and statues of forgotten gods. She did not stop until she reached her mother's garden, the only place in the palace where silence lived, without cruelty. There she fell to her knees beside the reflecting pool and stared into the water. "What have I done?" she whispered. The reflection offered no answer, only her own face, pale and full of things she did not yet understand. A voice broke the silence. "You gave him a chance." It was Daedalus, the builder, the exile, the man who had carved a monster's prison and cursed himself in the process. He stepped from the shadow of the olive trees, his eyes dark and knowing. "You've changed the pattern," he said softly. "I don't care. You will. He's not like the others. That's what makes him dangerous. To whom, my father?" Daedalus shook his head. "To the gods. To the maze. To you." Ariadne looked back into the water. "If he dies, I'll know I was wrong. But if he lives, then Crete will burn." Daedalus finished. "And everything you know will end. Then let it end." That night the winds above the palace shifted. The sea grew restless, and in the heart of the labyrinth, where blood had been soaked into the walls and screams etched into the floor, a thread of gold shimmered through the dark, while a monster stirred from sleep. The thread of hope darkness, not the kind that follows sunset or hides behind clouds. No, this was the darkness of ancient things, of forgotten breath of stone, carved by sorrow and sealed by silence. Theseus stepped forward, one hand on the wall, the other holding the golden thread Ariadne had given him. It glowed faintly in his palm, humming with warmth. Guidance spun not from silk, but from will. Behind him the massive stone door had sealed shut. Before him the labyrinth yawned. There were no maps, no signs, no logic. Only the endless passage of stone after stone, corridor after corridor, each turn leading to another turn, as though the walls themselves wished to erase his memory. And already the whispers had begun. They weren't words, no voice, no tongue, but memory fragments. Thoughts that weren't his. "I am alone. There is no way out. There is no Minotaur. Only death." He shook them off. They were tricks he knew. The labyrinth was more than stone. It was a mind. And he was now inside it. For hours Theseus walked. He marked each wall with a scratch from his knife. But it meant nothing. The walls twisted behind him, paths rearranged. Only the golden thread remained constant, stretched tight behind him like a promise. He passed piles of bones, scraps of torn cloth, once a bronze bracelet stained with old blood. He did not allow himself to look too long. He only whispered, "I will not die in here." Time passed differently inside the labyrinth. The air grew thick and sour. Shadows moved where they shouldn't. At one point, Theseus found himself staring at a wall, breathing heavily, unsure of how long he'd been standing still. Then he heard it, a breath, not his own. It came from deeper ahead, wet, ragged, trembling with hunger. The hairs on his arms lifted. He pressed his back to the wall, heartbeat, steady eyes narrowing. and the thread trembled in his fingers. As he turned the next corner, the passage widened stone, giving way to a chamber circular and vast. Columns surrounded the room carved with ancient runes, each one cracked by age. And in the center, dragging claws across the stone, stood the Minotaur. It was larger than the myths said, nearly 8 feet tall, with the chest of a man and the head of a bull, its horns twisted like tree roots, its eyes glowing yellow in the dark. Muscles rippled beneath fur, matted with blood, and a chain still hung from one wrist, broken long ago. It did not speak, but it saw him, and it remembered. Theseus drew his blade, not a sword of kings, but a knife forged in Athens, simple, clean, meant for war. The Minotaur stepped forward, hooves cracking the ground. It exhaled a sound between a growl and a cry, pain and rage in equal measure. Then it charged. The first strike was wild. Theseus ducked beneath it, slashing the creature's side. Blood sprayed against the wall, thick and black. But the beast didn't slow. It turned faster than expected, backhanding him across the room. Theseus hit a column hard. His breath flew from his lungs. Pain flared down his spine. He stood anyway. Again the Minotaur came. This time Theseus waited. As the beast lunged, he dove low, slicing the tendon behind its knee. It bellowed an inhuman sound that shook dust from the ceiling. It swung again. Theseus rolled away, came up behind it, stabbed deep into its side. The blade stuck. The creature howled, reared back, and slammed into the wall. Stone cracked. Theseus reached for his thread. It was still taut, still guiding him. But the Minotaur wasn't done. With one last cry, it rushed him, and Theseus met it head-on. He ducked the horns, grabbed the chain around its wrist and wrapped it tight, climbed the beast's back like a hunter atop a bull, and with both hands, he drove the blade into the back of its skull. Silence. Then the creature shuddered once, twice, and collapsed. Dust rose, and with it stillness. Theseus stood over the beast, shaking. It did not move. It would never move again. For a long moment, there was only breath, his own and the Labyrinth's, and then as though in response, the golden thread glowed brighter. He followed it, step by step, turn by turn. And though the maze tried to twist, tried to whisper, it could not break the thread. It could not undo hope. Hours later, the stone door groaned, and a figure stepped out, covered in blood, breathless, but alive. Theseus. The guards stared in shock. The priests dropped their scrolls. Even Minos, who stood nearby, paled. "You," he whispered. Theseus said nothing. He turned to Ariadne, who stood alone beside the seawall, and held out his hand. Escape by moonlight. The moon rose over Knossos like a watchful eye, silver silent and too full of knowing. By the time the labyrinth gates had groaned open, and Theseus stepped into the night, everything had changed. The creature was dead. The curse was broken, and for the first time in decades, no Athenian had died. Guards rushed forward, but did not dare lay hands on him. There was blood on his arms, some his, most not. A golden thread trailed from his hand like divine proof. Behind him, the black mouth of the labyrinth whispered no more. Minos descended the stone steps with low, deliberate rage. "You killed it. I freed your city," Theseus answered. "You've defied your god," Minos snarled. "Then let your god answer me himself." There was a moment of electric silence, as though the gods themselves leaned down to listen. But no thunder came. No earthquake, no divine fire, only the low lapping of waves against the cliffside, and the sound of something ancient and unjust finally coming to an end. Ariadne watched from the balcony above, hands trembling around the edge of the marble railing. He had done it. He was alive. She saw the way Minos looked at him now, not as a boy, but as a symbol. And symbols, when left unchecked, became revolutions. Her father would not allow that. She turned and ran. Theseus stood at the edge of the great square. The other tributes had gathered eyes wide with disbelief. Some wept. Some laughed, like those just awakened from death. He walked to them. "We leave tonight," he said. But the ship's one began. "We take one," Theseus said. "And anyone who stops us can answer to my blade." That night the sky remained cloudless, too clear as if holding its breath. Ariadne waited in the garden where she had first given him the thread. The air smelled of myrrh and memory. She wore a simple cloak, no jewels, no braid. In her hands she held a satchel. She turned as footsteps approached. It was him, not the prince who had come to die, but the man who had refused fate. "You came," she said. "You're the reason I'm alive." "Then let's live," she whispered. They moved quickly. Theseus had already prepared the ship, a slender black-sailed vessel used for royal transport. The guards on night watch were few, and most had already heard rumors of the impossible. None dared stand against the one who had slain the monster of Crete. One by one the Athenians boarded. Some kissed the stone of Knossos one last time. Others did not look back at all. Theseus helped Ariadne into the boat, then untied the ropes with quiet, practiced fingers. The tide pulled them away like a secret. As they passed the harbor mouth, a cry rose from the cliffs above. "Thief!" It was Minos. His voice rolled like thunder down the hill. "You steal my blood, my name." Theseus stood tall on the deck. "No, I leave only what you made." And then they were gone. The cliffs faded. The torches dimmed, and the island of Crete fell behind them like a fading nightmare. For 2 days the sea held them gently. The winds were kind, the water warm. The Athenians rested in silence or song. Laughter returned in hesitant waves. And Theseus, he stood beside Ariadne. Neither of them spoke much, but in the silence between them was 1,000 things unsaid. Hope, grief, beginning. On the 3rd night they landed at a small wild island known as Naxos. It was uninhabited, covered in pine and white rock, its beaches soft with volcanic ash. They made camp beside a crescent bay, lit a small fire, and shared fruit stolen from Minos' storehouse. It was here that Theseus and Ariadne first kissed beneath a ski scattered with gods who dared not interrupt. It was here they whispered futures. It was here they dreamed. But dreams are fragile things, and gods do not forget when mortals steal what was never theirs. That night, while the others slept, Theseus dreamt. He stood alone on a vast plain of white sand. The stars above were silent, and the sea had turned to glass. A man stood before him, tall, wild-eyed, wreathed in grapevines and gold, barefoot, eternal. Dionysus, god of wine, of madness, of divine passion. "You are brave," the god said. "And she is free," Theseus replied. "No," said Dionysus gently. "She was never yours to take." Theseus clenched his fists. "She chose me. She was promised to me long before you learned to walk," Dionysus said. "She is part of something larger. I will not leave her." Theseus whispered. "You already have said," the god, and the dream shattered. He woke with salt in his mouth and guilt in his bones. Ariadne still slept beside the dying fire, curled like a question. He stood, looked at her breath, her peace, and his own face reflected in the ash. Then he turned. When the sun rose, Ariadne opened her eyes to an empty shore. The ship was gone, the sails a distant ghost on the horizon. She did not scream. She did not weep. She stood and waited. Dionysus's whisper mourning came slowly to the island of Naxos, as if the sun itself felt shame for rising on a broken promise. Ariadne sat by the tide's edge, her fingers buried in the sand, her eyes fixed on the sea. The waves rolled in gentle, careless rhythm, but the black-sailed ship that had carried her hope was gone only a thin line on the horizon, now vanishing like a memory too painful to recall. She did not cry, not yet. She only watched and waited for the feeling in her chest to make sense, rage or heartbreak, or some divine mixture of both. The fire had long gone out, but the ashes still smoked. Somewhere far ahead on the Aegean, Theseus stood at the prow of the ship, wind in his face, but the salt on his skin tasted wrong. The other Athenians slept unaware that something precious had been left behind. Not gold, not treasure, but a thread not spun by Ariadne, but of her. His hands gripped the wood tighter. It was her or all of us, he muttered to the wind, but the wind did not answer because it knew. Back on Naxos, Ariadne rose at last. She walked the beach in silence, barefoot and crownless, letting the sea wash away the prints he had left in the sand. She stopped where the fire had been. Only embers, no cloak, no farewell, only absence. And then she felt it, a hum in the air, like music without sound, like a song whispered inside the heart. She turned, and he was there. He stood barefoot among the olive trees, clothed in nothing but wine-colored robes and light. His hair fell wild over his shoulders. His eyes were galaxies undone. Dionysus, the god of ecstasy and madness, of wine and chaos, of joy that drowns and pain that dances. You waited, he said. I was abandoned, she replied. No, he said softly. You were delivered. She narrowed her eyes. I do not belong to you. He stepped forward, the air shifting with him like a dream taking form. You belong to yourself, Ariadne, but your heart has always been mine. Ariadne felt her knees weaken, not from fear, but from the weight of something ancient unfolding in her blood. He left me, she whispered, more to herself than to the god. Dionysus reached out and took her hand. Because you were never meant to follow a thread. She looked up at him. Then what was I meant to follow? He smiled, and the sky shimmered with it. The stars. For days Dionysus remained with her. He led her through the hidden valleys of the island, where grapes grew wild, and music danced on the wind without instruments. He spoke of fate, not as a cage, but as a stage. Not fixed, but flowing. He taught her laughter and wine, and how even gods get lost in the beauty of a mortal heart. And Ariadne began to breathe again, not because she forgot, but because she remembered herself. In the center of Naxos stood an altar older than the gods of Olympus. It was here Dionysus led her one twilight, where the sky burned violet and the sea had stilled like glass. He offered her a crown, not of gold, but of stars. A circle of 7 lights that pulsed with divine warmth, lifted from the heavens for her, and her alone. Be not the girl who waits on shores, he said. Be the queen the tides remember. She took it, placed it upon her brow, and in that moment, Ariadne ceased to be a pawn in a labyrinth. She became a constellation. Some say she rose into the sky that night, hand in hand with the god of wine, crowned in starlight. Some say she ruled Naxos as goddess and queen, her laughter shaking the vines, her tears turning to jewels in the soil. But all agree on one thing: she was never forgotten, because in every story there is a thread that outlasts the maze, and hers was starlit. The forgotten shore. The sea was calm, but the silence on the ship was heavier than waves or wind. Theseus stood alone at the prow, eyes forward, but soul adrift. The sail above him, black as coal, fluttered like a banner of mourning, though none aboard yet understood why. The Athenians slept or whispered in quiet circles, some dreaming of home, others not daring to dream at all. But Theseus did not speak, not since Naxos, not since her. Each day the ship moved closer to Athens, and each day the memory of Ariadne curled tighter in his chest, her voice, her thread, her crown of silence beneath the moon. He had left her, not because he wished to, not because he feared, but because a god had demanded it, and he, a mortal, had obeyed. Now he bore the weight of victory like a crown made of iron. He had slain the Minotaur. He had freed his people, and yet he felt more lost than in the deepest corridors of the Labyrinth. When Athens appeared on the horizon, the city glittered like a promise. White stone gleamed on the cliffs. Olive groves shimmered in the wind. And the people gathered at the harbor, eyes wide with hope. They had counted the days. They had watched the sea. And now at last, the black-sailed ship returned. King Aegeus stood on the high walls of the Acropolis, his aged hands gripping the stone. His eyes clouded by time and fear, locked onto the ship approaching the shore. The sails were black, black as death, black as the promise Theseus had sworn to break. His heart, already heavy from years of tribute and grief, cracked. "My son," he whispered, "he is lost." And with that the king of Athens stepped forward and fell into the sea. The ship docked moments later. Theseus, unaware bare of the tragedy unfolding above, stepped ashore in solemn silence. The people stared in awe. He was thinner, older, covered in scars and silence. But he was alive, a hero. The children who had once been chosen for sacrifice ran to him. The city rang with cheers. Trumpets sounded, but the hero did not smile. It was only hours later when a palace guard delivered the news that the final thread snapped. "The king," they said. He threw himself from the cliffs. When he saw the sails, Theseus collapsed to his knees. The color drained from the world. He had returned in triumph and brought death in his wake. They buried Aegeus by the sea that bore his name. And though the people crowned Theseus as their king, though they sang his name in every corner of the land, though statues rose and fires were lit, Theseus wore the crown with the weight of two ghosts on his shoulders, a father broken by a signal forgotten, a woman left on a lonely warshore. In the quiet nights that followed, he often walked alone through the palace gardens. The stars overhead gleamed bright, but one cluster always caught his gaze. 7 stars arranged in a crown. They called it Corona Borealis, but he knew its true name, Ariadne, King of Ashes. The throne of Athens was carved from white marble, veined with blue, like the veins in an old man's hand. It stood atop the Acropolis, overlooking the sea that had taken Aegeus and brought Theseus home. But the young hero who sat on it did not feel like a king. He felt like a survivor, and sometimes like a thief. The cheers had faded. The festivals ended. Statues were raised in his name, but they stood cold and still unmoved by the quiet that lingered in the palace halls. The laughter of courtiers echoed like ghosts. The throne room had weight, not majesty, because Athens did not yet know what to do with a king who had returned not in victory but in fragments. Theseus ruled, but he did not rejoice. Each day he passed the place where his father had fallen. He would stop and stare down into the Aegean, no longer just a sea, but a grave. The water glittered uncaring, eternal. He had meant to hoist white sails. He had meant to return with Ariadne by his side. But what he returned with was a sword, a ghost, and a silence he could not shake. In council, the elders praised him. You've ended the tribute to Crete. You've broken the chain of blood. You are the greatest of kings. But Theseus said little. At night he dreamed not of thrones or glory, but of a spool of thread winding backward into darkness, of footsteps echoing in a stone maze, of a woman left on a moonlit beach whispering his name to waves that did not answer. Athens prospered under his rule. The people revered him. Roads were paved, treaties signed. The city grew strong. But inside, the king Apollo had taken root. He tried to fill it. He trained harder, hunted more, fought wars he did not need to fight. He sailed to distant islands, hoping the wind might blow him to Naxos by accident. But no storm was kind enough, and no god dared speak of what had passed. One night Theseus stood alone in the temple of Poseidon, where Aegeus had once begged for a son. He placed no offering on the altar, only a question: what did I become? The sea outside answered with wind, but the gods stayed silent. Time moved forward as it always does. Theseus grew older, wiser, colder. The labyrinth he had escaped had been made of stone and blood, but the one he built around himself was far harder to leave. The bards sang of him, of his triumph, of the monster he slew. But they never sang of the love he left, or the father he broke, or the weight of a crown forged not in gold but in guilt. He was Theseus, hero of Athens, king of the land. But inside, he was still a boy in the maze, chasing a thread, looking for a way out. The last thread. Legends do not die. They drift into song, into stone, into silence. And so it was with Theseus, son of Aegeus slayer, of the Minotaur, king of Athens. His body grew older, but his name did not. His hair turned silver, but his story gleamed as gold in the mouths of poets. Yet in the quiet chambers of his soul, the thread remained, tugging always, always backward. The years blurred. Athens blossomed strong and radiant. Theseus expanded the city's reach, founded festivals, honored gods, ruled with reason. And yet he smiled less. He walked alone more often. And though he welcomed the love of others, none ever reached the place where Ariadne's name still echoed. In his final years, Theseus took fewer visitors. He spoke more to shadows than to courtiers, more to memory than to men. One night, under the weight of a sleepless moon, he stood on the same cliff where his father had leapt into the sea. The wind whipped through his cloak like a whisper of another lifetime, and there on the edge of sea and sky, he finally allowed himself to speak to her. I should have stayed. The waves did not answer, but the stars above shimmered, and in them he saw a faint glow, 7 points of light dancing in a gentle arc. Corona Borealis, you waited, he said, and then he smiled. Not the smile of a hero, but the smile of a man who had finally remembered how to feel. Some say he leapt, as his father had, into the sea, to be reunited in the place where all stories end. Others say he vanished into the wild places of the world, chasing the last thread of a myth that even time could not unravel. But those who listen closely on certain summer nights, when the sky is clear and the sea is still, say you can hear the sound of footsteps, light, determined wandering a labyrinth that exists only in memory. And sometimes, if the wind is right, you can hear two voices, one calm and sure, the other laughing, together again in a place where gods do not interfere, and endings are not final.